So, given that this is a retreat on compassion that we're doing, I have been looking at one particular antidote, which is trying to understand why people act the way that they do, or why they think the way that they do, or what their lives are like. And I see this as a connection between wisdom and compassion because once I better understand the difficulties or the suffering that somebody is going through, then I'm much more likely to have compassion for them instead of anger and to also be able to relate to them skillfully. So, to help me increase my understanding of one particular group, I picked up the book Strangers in Their Own Land. And this was written by a sociologist at the University of Berkeley in 2016. And she visited southern Louisiana. She interviewed people who lived right on the coast, whose lives had been pretty much destroyed by the oil and gas industries that are setting up rigs just offshore. But at the same time, they were totally against any kind of government regulation of the private industry or pretty much any government intervention whatsoever. And so the author, Arlie Russell Hochschild, she wanted to figure out why these people had views that seemed to contradict their own self interest. And she herself realized that she had what she calls empathy walls. And she really wanted to use her research to scale these walls and to knock them down, hopefully. And it seems she was quite successful in that. So she interviewed people from all different walks of life, and she came across what I think we've heard of before as compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue. She called it sympathy fatigue. So I'll just read some quotes of that. When explaining why a restaurant owner didn't support government assistance programs, he told the author that liberals want us to feel sympathy for blacks, women, the poor. And of course I do, up to a certain point. I hear stories and they break my heart. But then sometimes I don't know if I'm being had. And then he gave examples of when he met people who he felt didn't really need assistance yet were asking for it and taking it and trying to take advantage of the situation, basically. Another man told her, people think we're not good people if we don't feel sorry for blacks and immigrants and Syrian refugees. But I am a good person, and I don't feel sorry for them. And then another woman said, I know liberals want us to feel sorry for blacks. I know they think they are so idealistic, and we aren't. So, reading this, I found myself getting quite righteously judgmental, looking down on these people for being so selfish and mean. But then when I look at myself, I realize my compassion also has a lot of stipulations attached to it. Actually, my compassion is quite bureaucratic. And I'm not sure if this is because I work for the government. That might have an influence. But I think it's just the way I think. And it's actually the way a lot of people think. So, for example, my compassion usually only applies to certain groups of people. And I would call these the underprivileged, which include children, or the victims of unjustified harm and exclusion. However, even these groups of people can be found ineligible for my compassion if they meet any of the following criteria. They are wealthy, they have suffered few or no adverse circumstances in their life, they harm others, this includes criminals, they are arrogant and self-centered, or they hold certain political and religious beliefs that epitomize any of the aforementioned criteria. And as a result of all these stipulations that sentient beings must meet in order to qualify for my compassion, the circle of eligibility is actually quite small. And my heart remains closed to most of humanity. If that weren't sad enough, it's actually quite difficult to find anyone who meets all of these criteria at the same time. So someone who is underprivileged and victimized and poor and humble, etc. I think it might actually be impossible to find any sentient being that meets all of these criteria at once. Because all sentient beings have arrogance in their minds at some point in time. All sentient beings intentionally or unintentionally harm others because of their uncontrolled minds. Both people can be both a victim and a victimizer at different points in their life. And yeah, even poor people can be arrogant or racist or whatever. So to go back to the book, Strangers in Their Own Land, one of the people that the author interviewed, named Lee, used to work at a chemical company that fired him because an accident temporarily disabled him. But this didn't seem to affect his anti-governmental and anti-regulation views. So the accident involved a huge vat of chemicals being dumped on him, and they nearly burned all of the clothes right off of his body. When he submitted a reimbursement claim for his clothing, they only gave him a fifth of the $40 that he asked for because they told him he had already worn out those clothes. And then they fired him later for absenteeism when he couldn't come to work because he couldn't move his legs. So, of course, Lee was upset about how he was treated by the company that he had worked for a number of years. But he still retained his belief that the private sector should be as deregulated as possible. And that was part of what the author was trying to figure out. So Lee's story stands out in this book because he admits that one of his tasks at the chemical company was to regularly dump illegal toxic waste into the wetlands twice a day. And I will just say the amount of environmental degradation that is described in this book is shocking. And considering that most of the seafood, about a third of the shrimp and similar amounts of fish in the US come out of that region, is just really mind-blowing. And the whole area is completely toxic, basically. And yeah, there's a lot of evidence for that in this book. It was just shocking. But anyway, when I think of people who illegally dump toxic waste into fragile ecosystems, I assume they have no compassion for living beings and they have very poor ethics and integrity. However, the way that Lee tells his story shows me that this is not always true, and that my rigid compassion categories don't always meet the messy reality, the messiness of reality. So I wanted to read what he says. So one day after Lee's acid bath, he was told to take on another ominous job. It was to be done twice a day, usually after dusk, and always in secret. In order to do this job, Lee had to wield an 8-foot-long tar buggy propelled forward on 4 wheels. Loaded on this buggy was an enormous steel tank that held, quote, heavy bottoms, unquote, which are highly viscous tar residue of chlorinated hydrocarbon, basically toxic waste. So working overtime on evenings under the cover of dark with his respirator on, Lee would tow the tar buggy down a path that led towards the Calcasieu Ship Channel in one direction and towards Bayo de Inde in another. Lee would look around to make sure no one saw me and check if the wind was blowing away from him so as to avoid fumes blowing into his face. He backed the tar buggy up to the marsh. Then he said I'd bend down and open the faucet. Under the pressure of compressed air, the toxins would spurt out 20 or 30 feet into the gooey marsh. Lee waited until the buggy was drained off of the illegal toxic waste. No one ever saw me. So then Lee goes on. One day, while I was dumping the heavy bottoms in the canal, I saw a bird fly into the fumes and fall instantly into the water. It was like he'd been shot. I put 2 shovels out into the mud so I could walk on them into the marsh without sinking too far down. I walked out and picked up the bird. Its wings and body didn't move. It looked dead, but its heart was still beating. I grew up on a farm and I know about birds. I walked on the shovels to the bank with the bird. I held its head in my right hand and its wings and body in my left hand. I blew into its beak and worked it up and down. Then it started breathing again. Its eyes opened, but the rest of its body still didn't move. I put it on the hood of my truck, which was warm. Then I left the bird to go check my tar buggy. When I got back, the bird was gone. It had flown away. So that was one good thing. During the afternoon, Lee circles back to the story of the bird, alternating between it and the story of the tar buggy. I knew what I did was wrong, he repeats. Toxins are a killer, and I'm very sorry I did it. My mama would not have wanted me to do it. I never told anybody this before, but I knew how not to get caught. So before I read Lee's story, I felt quite justified in holding contempt for people who pollute the environment. But now I can see that people who do these kinds of things or harm others don't always enjoy it. They don't always want to do it. And they may feel quite conflicted about it and then guilty about it afterwards. And they're also still capable of love and compassion in many other ways and areas of their life. So my conclusion is that my compassion bureaucracy needs to audit itself and throw out all of those categories, because the assessment that it makes, it's actually quite laborious to have to do all those calculations. And it doesn't lead to the outcome of happiness for myself or others. It'd be better to just have compassion equally for all sentient beings, because we're all suffering in one way or another, even if it's not apparent on the surface. So I'd like to end with a quote from the Metta Sutta, which takes the clever approach of using categories to undermine their significance. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease.